Welcome to Swords and Hammers, where truth comes clothed in tales, and the soul remembers what the mind forgets. Settle in and listen well. The Warrior's Thirst, a tale of bone, blood, and water. They brought him to the Philistines like a sack of grain hauled to market. His own people did the binding. The men of Judah who should have stood beside him knotted the ropes and walked him forward through the dust, and not one of them met his eyes. 1,000 Philistine soldiers stood waiting at Lehi, armed with iron swords and the arrogance of men who believe numbers settle everything. They roared when they saw him. One man, bound, betrayed by his own tribe, delivered to the enemy like a tax payment. By every measure of war, it was already finished. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson. Not gently, not like a whisper or a nudge. It fell on him the way a hammer falls on rusted chain, and the ropes on his arms crumbled like thread held too long over a flame and dropped from his wrists into the dirt. His hands were free, and they were empty. He looked down and saw it lying among the stones, the jawbone of a donkey, still damp from a recent death. An unclean thing by every measure of the law, a piece of refuse no warrior would carry, and no general would dignify with the name of weapon. He picked it up. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter, and it was holy. He moved through those iron-armed ranks, the way a flooding river moves through a fence of reeds, and the bone in his hand didn't shatter. 100 fell, then 200. The Philistines pressed in tighter. Believing mass would crush what skill could not. They were wrong. 500, then 700. The dust rose thick as smoke around them, and the screaming thinned as the voices that made it were silenced one by one. 1,000 men lay dead at Lehi before the jawbone finally rested, and Samson stood among the fallen. Chest heaving, arms streaked with blood and grime, and he opened his mouth. Not to pray, but to sing. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have piled them in heaps, he cried to the empty sky. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men. Listen to the pronoun, I. I have done this. The bone did not choose to be lifted. It made no contribution and claimed no glory. But the hand that gripped it was already stealing credit for a victory it could never have earned. Then the singing stopped. It stopped because his tongue had swollen against his teeth, and his throat had closed to a thin, burning passage, no wider than a straw. The sun over Lehi had no mercy in it. It pressed down on the field of the dead like a hand pressing a wound, and the smell of blood and dust thickened until he could taste copper at the back of his mouth. The man who had just destroyed 1,000 armed soldiers could not produce a single mouthful of water to keep himself alive. This is the part of the story that no one wants to hear. The aftermath, when the roaring fades, and you find that the strength was never yours. Samson's knees buckled, and he went down hard among the fallen. His hands, the same hands that had swung the jawbone with power no mortal possesses, clawed at the dry ground as though the earth might yield something to a man who had nothing left to demand. His lips had split in the heat. Each breath scraped through him like sand drawn through a cracked pipe. He could feel his pulse thinning, his vision shrinking to a narrow tunnel of white light, his body failing him, one system at a time. the way a besieged wall fails. First the cracks, then the groan, then the collapse. He was dying, not from a Philistine sword, but from thirst, surrounded by 1,000 proofs of a power he could not claim and could not sustain. Here is the truth, the comfortable ages, keep trying to bury. Your greatest danger arrives not before the victory, but after it. Not when the enemy presses in, but when the enemy is broken and you stand alone with the delusion that your own arm won the day. God does not allow that delusion to survive. He loves you too fiercely for that. He will let you go thirsty until you remember where the water comes from. Samson's prayer was not beautiful. It was the raw, hoarse cry of a man who had run out of everything except honesty. You have accomplished this great victory by the strength of your servant, he rasped through cracked lips. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of these pagans? Notice what thirst accomplished that triumph could not. In one breath he had boasted, I have killed. In the next he confessed, you have accomplished. Desperation corrected his theology in a single sentence, and God answered. He split the hollow ground at Lehi, and water came surging up from the broken earth. It pooled in the dust, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. Patient, ancient, and cold, Samson dragged himself to it on hands and knees and pressed his face to the ground and drank. The first mouthful hit his cracked throat like mercy itself. Sharp, almost painful, unbearably good. He drank until his hand stopped shaking, until his breath came steady, until the world widened again from that narrow tunnel back into sky and wind and the terrible, ordinary gift of being alive. The Jawbone served God's purpose for a nation. The spring served God's purpose for a soul. Then Samson did the wisest thing recorded in his entire, troubled life. He named the place, not the spring of the warrior, not the spring of victory, not the spring of the 1,000 slain. He named it En-hakkore, the spring of the one who cried out. The bone did not choose to be lifted, and neither did the man who held it. Both were instruments, one of calcium and decay, the other of flesh and foolish pride, and both were nothing the moment the hand of God released them. The narrator gives one quiet line to what followed. Samson judged Israel for 20 years during the time of Philistine domination. One sentence for 20 years. 7 sentences for one violent afternoon. But the 20 years required more courage than the afternoon ever did. 20 years of ordinary bread instead of miraculous fire, of waking each morning with no supernatural wind in his chest, remembering that the spring was named for his desperation, not his strength. The jawbone is long gone. The 1,000 corpses returned to the earth before the story was committed to ink. But the spring, the text tells us, was still flowing, still murmuring one truth to every fighter who would kneel low enough to hear it. The God who arms you for the impossible hour will sustain you through the ordinary years, but only if you stop boasting about what your hands have done and start crying out for what only His hands can give. You know this ground. You have knelt here before, parched after some victory you thought was yours, wondering why the sky has gone silent. The spring is still there. It was never meant for the strong. It was meant for those honest enough to whisper, I am dying, and I cannot save myself. Selah.